The little black girl hid behind a pile of quarry stones, calling the biker as heavy boots approached the ridge. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. A small, scared black girl stumbled through the woods, her bare feet bruised and bloodied from running too long without shoes. Her tiny body was trembling, eyes wide with fear, as she looked over her shoulder. Behind her, the sound of heavy boots grew louder with every step. She could hear the crunch of dry leaves, the steady approach of her pursuers, closing in on her like a predator on prey. In a moment of sheer desperation, she spotted a pile of old quarry stones at the base of a ridge. With what little strength she had left, she sprinted toward the pile, diving behind it just as the sound of the boots grew louder. She pressed her back against the cold stone, trying to steady her breathing, hoping that whoever was chasing her wouldn't see her hiding spot. But it wasn't long before her breath hitched again, and she realized she couldn't stay hidden for long. The sound of the boots was closer now, so close it felt as if the ground beneath her feet was shaking with every step. She could hear voices calling out, but she couldn't understand their words, just the fear in their tone. She needed help. Desperately. She needed someone strong, someone who could fight back. And that's when she remembered. Her father had always told her that if she ever found herself in trouble, she should call for help. And there was only one person she knew she could trust. A biker. A man who had promised her father years ago that he would always protect her if something ever happened. The girl, with shaking hands, pulled out the small device from her pocket. A phone, battered and old, but it would do the job. Her fingers trembled as she typed the name she had called. Out in her mind, biker. She hit send and prayed he'd hear her call. The heavy boots were now nearly on top of her, and she could feel the air change as the sound of a motorcycle revving pierced the silence. Relief flooded through her as the sound of the engine grew louder, the rumble unmistakable. She couldn't see him yet, but she knew he was coming. He had to be. With the heavy boots approaching, she closed her eyes for just a moment, trusting that the man she had called would come to save her. She could hear the footsteps stop, and then, in the distance, the unmistakable roar of a motorcycle engine echoed through the trees. She whispered, "Please hurry." The rumble of the motorcycle engine grew louder as the girl's heart began to race. The heavy boots she had been listening to for what seemed like forever had stopped, and all she could hear was the roar of an engine cutting through the air like a battle cry. She knew, she just knew, he was coming. It was the sound of hope. The girl held her breath, crouched behind the pile of quarry stones, praying the man who had promised her father years ago would arrive in time. Her hands trembled as she clutched the phone in her pocket. She'd sent the message. She had to believe he was on his way. The ground beneath her feet vibrated with the force of the bike's engine, the noise getting closer, then suddenly fading. She couldn't tell if he had spotted her or if he had just passed by. Her instincts screamed for her to peek out from behind the stones, but she stayed frozen, too scared to move. Then, as if the universe had answered her silent prayers, she heard the unmistakable roar of the engine right outside the ridge. The sound of the motorcycle coming to a halt made her heart leap. She dared a glance over her shoulder. There, just beyond the trees, stood a man on a motorcycle, his leather jacket gleaming in the dim light of the setting sun. He had the face of a warrior, weathered by time, yet kind, with eyes that seemed to see through the darkness. He pulled off his helmet, revealing a face marked by years of experience and pain. The girl's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the fear melting away as he looked in her direction. For the first time, she felt safe. The man had been a promise made years ago, and she knew he wouldn't break it. His eyes scanned the surroundings, and as he stepped off his bike, the ground beneath him seemed to settle. He was no longer a stranger. He was a protector. "You all right?" His voice was gravelly, as if the weight of every promise he'd ever made was etched into it. The girl nodded, tears streaming down her face. She had no words, only the overwhelming feeling that help had finally arrived. He knelt down to her level, his massive frame towering over her, yet his presence comforting. "Where is he?" he asked, his voice calm, yet sharp, like a blade ready for action. She pointed toward the woods where the heavy boots had been. "They were after me," she whispered. "And my brother." He nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing as he stood up, turning to look at the ridge ahead. "Stay here," he said. "I'm going to get your brother back." She nodded, still unable to speak. She didn't feel the need to. He had promised her father he would protect her, and that promise was all she needed. He wasn't just a biker. He was the promise of safety, of justice. The man swung back onto his bike with practiced ease, and without a second thought, revved the engine, a deafening sound that shattered the silence of the ridge. As the sound of the bike faded into the distance, the girl stayed crouched behind the quarry stones, waiting. She had never felt so vulnerable, yet at the same time, so secure in her own skin. The man had arrived. He would find her brother. He would keep his word. She couldn't help but close her eyes, her mind racing with thoughts of what would come next. As she waited, the distant echo of the engine made her think of one thing. It was only a matter of time before everything changed. He would bring her brother back. She just had to trust him, trust the promise that had kept her alive all this time. The sound of the motorcycle engines faded into the distance, but the girl could still feel the reverberation deep in her chest. Her heart was still racing as she stayed crouched behind the pile of quarry stones, trying to keep quiet, trying to keep still. She knew that the biker would take care of everything, but her mind kept replaying the moment when she had been so helpless, trapped in the woods with nowhere to go. The man on the bike had brought a sense of calm, but the fear still lingered. She stared out into the trees, her small frame barely visible against the jagged stones. Each second felt like an eternity. She had to trust him. She had no other choice. He was the promise her father had made, the promise that she would be safe. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her breath, when the distant rumble of the motorcycle echoed back in the distance. It wasn't the same engine she had heard earlier. No, this one was louder, more aggressive. She froze, her pulse quickening. Had he found trouble? Was something wrong? Her fingers twitched at the thought of it, but she couldn't move. She was stuck, waiting, praying that the biker would be all right. Then, through the trees, she saw it. His motorcycle, gleaming in the fading light, cutting through the thickening shadows of the woods. He was back. She didn't know why, but she felt relief wash over her. She couldn't explain it. He had only just arrived, but she already felt safer with him near. The man on the bike stopped just short of where she was hiding. He got off his bike, his boots making a sharp sound against the ground as he surveyed the area. His eyes flicked toward her hiding spot, and he nodded slightly, as if to reassure her. "Stay low," he muttered under his breath. She nodded, unable to speak. He turned and started walking, his massive figure moving toward the trees. The girl watched him, feeling the weight of his presence as he moved through the woods like a man who had seen it all. He wasn't just any biker. He was someone who knew how to handle himself, someone who had made promises in the past and kept them. She could hear the sounds of rustling leaves as he moved deeper into the forest, his movements deliberate, calculated. He wasn't afraid, and neither was she anymore. She knew he was here for her brother. The man moved swiftly, his eyes scanning the area with precision. He was on a mission, and he wasn't going to stop until it was complete. As he reached the edge of the forest, he paused, turning to look back toward the girl. She stayed hidden, her eyes wide, watching him as he moved like a predator, always on guard. "I'll bring him back," he called out to her, his voice strong, unwavering. The girl nodded again, her heart swelling with hope. She believed him. He didn't need to say anything more. She could hear the sound of his boots crunching through the underbrush, and then the distant growl of his bike's engine once more. He was heading toward the ridge, and she knew that the confrontation was about to unfold. She remained silent, waiting, knowing that the next few moments would decide everything. A few minutes later, she heard the familiar roar of the engine again. This time, it was different. The sound was more intense, more urgent. The biker was back. The girl didn't move from her hiding place. She couldn't. She had to stay hidden, stay out of sight, stay safe. But the fear, the uncertainty, still lingered. She heard the man's voice in the distance, but the words were muffled. She couldn't make them out. Then came the unmistakable sound of a struggle, a sharp, guttural shout, followed by a thud. The girl's heart stopped. She held her breath. What was happening? Was the man in danger? Was it over? She waited. It felt like hours passed in the space of a few seconds. Finally, the sound stopped. Everything went still. She heard the motorcycle engine rev, and then the soft hum of it fading away like a distant echo. She waited, counting the seconds in her mind, until she heard the familiar crunch of boots against the forest floor once more. The biker emerged from the shadows, his figure outlined against the fading light. The girl's breath caught in her throat as she looked at him, searching his face for any sign of what had happened. He walked toward her, his steps steady, unhurried. "It's done," he said quietly. His voice was calm, but there was something in it that told her it had been a fight, a battle of some kind. He didn't need to say anything else. She knew it was over. Her brother was safe. He was coming back with him. And with that, everything changed. She had been rescued. Her heart raced, but this time it was out of relief. The biker had kept his promise. He always did. The biker stood still for a moment, his eyes scanning the surroundings before he finally approached the girl and her brother. He had been through wars, seen the worst of humanity, but there was something about this moment, about these kids, that pulled at his heart in a way he couldn't explain. He had promised her father. He had promised he would protect her, and today, he had kept that promise. The girl watched him as he walked toward her, still holding her brother's hand, a sense of relief flooding over her as she realized that the nightmare was over. The man, this stranger who was now her savior, knelt in front of her, his towering figure now at her level. "You're safe now," he said, his voice soft but firm, the weight of his words like a shield around her. "I told you I'd get him back." The girl nodded, her eyes filled with tears, her body still trembling from the terror she had just escaped. She wanted to say something, but the words were caught in her throat. She had never felt so vulnerable, so afraid, but now, she felt something else. She felt hope. Her brother squeezed her hand tightly, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to breathe. The biker stood up slowly, looking toward the road ahead. "We need to get you both to safety. This area is too dangerous," he said, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Come on." He motioned for them to follow, and the girl nodded, her legs shaky but determined. As they walked, the sound of the biker's footsteps was the only noise that filled the air. It was quiet now, but she knew that wouldn't last long. The man had done his part, but they weren't out of danger yet. The girl glanced at her brother. He looked scared, still processing everything that had happened. His face was pale, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. She squeezed his hand again, giving him a small, reassuring smile, though she wasn't sure if it was for his sake or her own. The biker led them down a narrow path, away from the ridge, toward the safety of the nearby town. The tension in the air was palpable, and the girl couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking, something more dangerous than they had already faced. "Don't worry," the biker said suddenly, breaking the silence. "I'll make sure you're safe. Nobody's getting near you again." His words were comforting, but the girl knew that the road ahead would still be dangerous. They had made it this far, but she didn't know how much longer it would take before they could truly feel safe. As they walked through the woods, the girl's mind raced. She thought about her parents, her life before all this. It felt like a distant memory now, like a dream she could barely remember. But now, there was a sense of clarity. She had been given a second chance, and she would hold on to it for as long as she could. The man walking beside her wasn't just a biker. He was her protector, the one who had come through when everything seemed lost. She glanced up at him again, seeing the determination in his eyes. He was here to make sure they were okay, and she had to believe that. They reached the edge of the forest, and the girl saw the flickering lights of the town in the distance. She knew they were close now, close to safety. But her mind kept returning to the events that had led them here, to the terror that had threatened to take away everything. She tried to push those thoughts away, focusing instead on the future, on the safety she knew they would find once they reached town. The biker turned to look at her, his face softening. "You're strong," he said. "I can see it in your eyes. You're going to be okay." The girl nodded again, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had never met anyone like him before. Someone who would risk everything to protect people he barely knew. He wasn't just a biker. He was a lifeline. As they made their way toward the town, the girl realized that she had been wrong about a lot of things. She had thought she was alone, that no one could help her. But now she knew better. There were people out there, people who would fight for what's right, no matter the cost. The future felt uncertain, but for First time in a long time. She felt like she had a chance to rebuild. She wasn't alone anymore. The biker had kept his word, and that meant everything. As the town grew closer, she let out a deep breath, the weight of the day slowly lifting off her shoulders. They were almost there, almost safe, and she had the biker to thank for that. The town was just ahead now, its lights flickering in the distance like the promise of safety, but the girl couldn't shake the weight on her chest. The biker, walking beside her and her brother, didn't say much as they approached the outskirts, but she could feel the tension in the air. He was no stranger to danger, that much was clear, but even someone like him had to be cautious. They had come so far, but there was still the gnawing feeling of what might happen next. What if they weren't really safe? What if this wasn't over? As they neared the edge of town, the girl could hear the faint hum of voices, the sounds of people moving about in the streets. For a moment, it almost felt like everything was normal again, like they had just stumbled upon a quiet town on a random day. But it was a lie. Nothing about the past few hours had been normal, and this was far from just another day. The biker stopped, glancing over his shoulder to make sure they weren't being followed. His face was set in a hard expression, but his eyes softened when they landed on the girl. "We'll get you settled," he said, his voice low but steady. She nodded, her throat tight. She wanted to speak, to thank him for everything, but words failed her. Her heart was still racing, her mind trying to process everything that had happened. She had been running, hiding, fearing for her life, and now she was on the verge of safety. But it felt unreal, like something was bound to ruin it. "We'll get you both somewhere safe," the biker continued, his voice breaking through her thoughts. "You're not alone anymore. I promise you that." The girl nodded again, a small, shaky breath escaping her. She trusted him. She had to. He was the only thing standing between her and the nightmare that had chased her for so long. As they entered the town, the streets grew quieter. The buildings were mostly old, worn with age, but well kept. The girl glanced around, her senses still heightened. Her brother, who had been silent for the last few minutes, looked up at her, his small hand clutching hers tightly. His eyes were wide, filled with fear and exhaustion, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. She could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders, the way he was trying to process everything that had happened. She wished she could take that burden from him, but she knew that for now, she couldn't. The biker led them through the town, not stopping, not letting anyone see them for too long. He was careful, protective, every movement deliberate, like a man who had spent years keeping promises made in the darkest of times. They arrived at a small, unassuming house on the edge of town. It wasn't much, but to the girl, it felt like a fortress. Safe. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to relax. The biker motioned for them to follow him inside. "Stay here for now," he said as he opened the door. "I'll make sure you're not followed. We'll get everything sorted." The girl and her brother stepped inside, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they were out of the danger zone. The room was small but cozy. There was a fireplace in the corner, and the smell of something cooking in the kitchen. It felt normal, like they could finally take a break. She looked at her brother, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, she allowed herself a smile. "It's over," she whispered to him, as though saying it aloud could make it true. But she wasn't sure if it was. Not yet. She had no idea what kind of danger might still be lurking out there, what kind of enemies the biker had made, or what it all meant for their future. But for now, in this moment, they were safe. The door creaked open again, and the biker stepped inside, closing it quietly behind him. He looked at them both, his face still serious, but his eyes soft with reassurance. "I'll get you both squared away. You'll have everything you need. I won't let anything happen to you," he said, his words steady but firm. The girl nodded, her heart feeling lighter now that they were inside. But she knew this wasn't over. There was still much more to do, and the biker wasn't the only one who had to protect them. But in this moment, she could finally breathe. The nightmare had ended, at least for now. She had survived. They had survived. And that was more than she had ever hoped for. The night had settled over the small town like a thick blanket, the soft hum of crickets filling the air as the girl sat by the window. She couldn't help but glance at the street outside, her eyes constantly darting toward the shadows. The events of the past hours still weighed heavily on her mind. She had thought that once they reached the house, once they were safe, everything would settle. But now, as she sat there in silence, The uncertainty crept back. What if the danger wasn't over? What if the people chasing her had connections, had resources she didn't understand? What if this man, this biker who had saved them, wasn't as invincible as she believed? She shook her head. No, she had to trust him. He had made promises to her father. He had kept them. Her brother, sitting beside her, looked just as lost in thought. His face had softened since they arrived, but she could still see the fear in his eyes. He hadn't spoken much since they arrived, and she knew it was because he didn't understand everything that was happening. He had been too young to understand the terror they had just escaped, but she could see it in the way he held on to her, the way he seemed to shrink whenever a door creaked open. She wanted to comfort him, but she didn't have the words. She wasn't sure how to explain any of this to him. A knock at the door broke the silence. She stood up quickly, glancing at the biker, who was sitting in the corner, keeping an eye on the room. His gaze was sharp, his hand resting on the handle of the knife he kept tucked at his side. He stood up slowly, walking toward the door with purpose, but without hesitation. He wasn't afraid. She could tell that much. He opened the door, revealing a man standing on the other side. The man was tall, with a heavy build, dressed in dark clothing, his face partially obscured by the brim of his hat. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his eyes scanning the room quickly before resting on the biker. "You got them safe?" the man asked, his voice low and gravelly. The biker nodded, stepping aside to let the man in. "They're safe here. No one's coming after them. Not tonight." The man's eyes flicked toward the girl and her brother, then back to the biker. "Good. Keep it that way. We can't afford any mistakes." The biker didn't respond right away. He simply nodded, as though he understood. The girl, who had been watching the exchange in silence, felt a chill run down her spine. She had thought that they were safe. But this man's words made her question everything. What had they walked into? Who were these people? The biker motioned for her and her brother to sit down, and they did, though the girl's heart was pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of the conversation, the pressure in the air. She wasn't sure what was happening, but it didn't feel right. The man at the door turned to leave, pausing only once to glance back at the biker. "Stay alert," he said before stepping out and disappearing into the night. The biker closed the door behind him, his expression unreadable. He turned to face the girl, his eyes softening just a fraction as he walked toward them. "Don't worry," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You're safe here. Nothing's going to happen to you. I won't let it." The girl nodded, but doubt still gnawed at her. The world outside that door was a dark, dangerous place. And no matter how hard the biker tried to reassure her, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. She glanced at her brother, who had finally relaxed enough to rest his head against her shoulder. She ran her fingers through his hair, a quiet gesture that made her feel like she was holding on to something solid in a world that seemed to be slipping out of control. The biker sat down across from them, his eyes studying the room carefully. His body language was tense, as though he was waiting for something, expecting something to happen. And then, just when the silence felt unbearable, he spoke again. "We've got work to do," he said, his voice low, almost to himself. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot." The girl's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't ask him what he meant. She didn't need to. She knew that as long as they were in this town, there would be danger. There would be threats, and there would be people who wouldn't let them go that easily. And somehow, she knew that the biker wasn't just here to protect them. He was in this fight too. She didn't know how, but she could see it in his eyes. He had his own reasons for being here, his own demons to face. And just like her, he wasn't running away. He was going to fight, no matter what it took. The night stretched on, but the girl felt a sense of resolve settling in her chest. This was far from over. But as long as the biker was there, as long as they were together, they might just stand a chance. The morning arrived quietly, with a soft light creeping through the edges of the window blinds. The girl sat up in bed, her body still aching from the exhaustion of the past days, but her mind was wide awake. She glanced over at her brother, who was still curled up in a blanket on the floor beside her. He looked so small, so fragile in this new place, but at least here, at least now, they were safe. She allowed herself a deep breath, taking in the unfamiliar but comforting surroundings. The house was small, the walls lined with old wood, but it felt like a sanctuary compared to the woods they had fled from. The biker had made good on his promise. He had gotten them to safety, but she knew deep down that they weren't done yet. The promise of safety didn't mean the danger had passed. It just meant that they had a moment to regroup. She couldn't shake the thoughts of what might come next. As much as she wanted to believe that it was over, she knew it wasn't. The world outside that door was still as dark and dangerous as it had always been. Her mind kept replaying the man's words the night before. "We've got work to do." There was more to this fight. She could feel it. The biker was right. She needed to be ready. Her brother stirred in his sleep, and she smiled faintly, brushing her fingers through his hair before standing up. She had to keep moving. She had to keep pushing forward, for him, for herself, for the life that was still ahead. The girl stepped into the small living room, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of the biker. The air smelled faintly of coffee, and the low hum of the stove told her he was already up, probably preparing something for them to eat. She was grateful for the silence, for the quiet moments, but the weight of uncertainty pressed down on her like a heavy cloak. "You're up early." The biker's voice broke through her thoughts, and she turned to see him standing in the kitchen doorway. His eyes met hers with that same steady gaze, the one that always made her feel safe even when she knew he was hiding his own fears. "Couldn't sleep," she admitted, her voice quiet but firm. "There's still something I'm missing." The biker nodded slowly, his hands resting on the counter as he watched her. "Yeah, I get it," he said, his voice low. "The hardest part is over. But it's never really over." The girl swallowed hard, trying to process his words. She wanted to believe him, wanted to feel the relief that should have come with safety, but something deep inside her told her that they hadn't seen the worst of it. Not yet. The door creaked open behind them, and her brother shuffled in, rubbing his eyes sleepily. He looked up at the biker and gave him a small, hesitant smile. The girl could see the fear still in his eyes, but there was something else there, too, a quiet trust. She smiled back at him, her heart aching. This wasn't over for either of them. Not yet. But they had each other. And for now, that had to be enough. The biker turned toward the stove, flipping the eggs he was cooking. "You guys hungry?" he asked, his tone casual but warm. "I've got enough for everyone." The girl nodded, her stomach growling at the thought of food. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the smell of breakfast filled the air. It wasn't much, just eggs and some toast, but it felt like a luxury. Something normal, something she hadn't had in so long. As they ate, the tension in the room seemed to ease just a little. They were together, safe, and for that brief moment, nothing else mattered. But as the meal ended and the silence settled back in, the girl couldn't shake the feeling that the calm was only temporary. She knew the danger was still out there, lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. The biker stood up, his movements deliberate. "I'm going to check in with a few people," he said, his voice firm. "Keep an eye on things. Stay here. You'll be safe." The girl stood as well, her hands clenched by her sides. "I'm not staying here. Not while there's still a threat out there." The biker looked at her, his gaze hardening, but there was no anger in his eyes. Only a quiet understanding. "I know, but I need you to trust me. Just for a little longer. Let me handle this." She hesitated, but she knew he was right. He had kept his promises so far, and if anyone could protect them, it was him. With a reluctant nod, she stepped back. "Okay, but you're not doing this alone. Not anymore." The biker gave her a small, approving nod before walking toward the door. "I'll be back soon," he said. As the door closed behind him, the girl stood in the quiet house, her mind racing with what came next. She didn't know what the future held, but she was ready. She had to be. For herself, for her brother, for the safety that was still so fragile, she would fight. She would stand beside the biker and face whatever came their way, because she wasn't alone anymore. The girl stood by the window, her fingers pressed against the cold glass, staring out into the quiet town. The morning light was softer now, casting long shadows on the streets. It had been hours since the biker left, and despite her earlier resolve, the uncertainty was creeping back in. She knew the danger hadn't passed, not entirely. She could feel it in the air, the unease, the sense that they were being watched. Her brother, still curled up on the couch, looked to be asleep, but she could see the way his eyes darted around the room when he thought she wasn't looking. He was scared, too. She couldn't blame him. Their whole world had been turned upside down in the last few days. What had been normal was now a distant memory, and what came next was completely unknown. She glanced at the clock. The biker had been gone longer than she expected. It was unsettling, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had to trust him. He had kept his word so far. Still, the silence in the house was starting to feel too heavy. The door creaked open, and she spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. But it was only the biker, stepping back into the room, his face tense. His eyes scanned the room quickly before landing on her. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice low and steady, though she could hear the hint of urgency underneath. She nodded quickly, though the tightness in her chest didn't ease. "Yeah, just waiting for you." He looked at her for a moment, his gaze steady but unreadable. "We've got a problem," he said, and for the first time, the girl felt the weight of his words like a punch to the gut. "What kind of problem?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The kind we can't ignore," he replied. "I've been in contact with a few people. There's a group that's been looking for you, looking for both of you. They're not going to stop." The girl's stomach dropped. She had known this moment was coming, but hearing it from him made it all feel too real. "Who are they?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. She could see it in the way he hesitated before answering. "I don't know their full reach, but they're dangerous. They've got connections. They're not just random people. They know who you are, and they'll stop at nothing to find you." Her mind raced, panic starting to creep in again. She thought she was safe. She thought they were hidden, but now it was clear that no place was truly safe. Not anymore. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The biker stepped forward, his presence like a wall between her and the world outside. "We fight back," he said firmly. "We don't run anymore. We stand our ground." She could see the fire in his eyes, the same fire that had gotten them this far. He wasn't afraid, and for a moment, that gave her the strength to breathe. He was right. They couldn't keep running forever. It was time to fight. She nodded, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "What's the plan?" she asked, her voice stronger now. "I'm going to get you two out of here, but I need your help. We're not going to face them alone." The girl's heart pounded in her chest. "What do you need me to do?" He looked at her with a sense of resolve, as if he had already made up his mind. "I need you to stay alert. Stay with your brother. If anything happens, I need you to get out of here as quickly as possible. Don't wait for me." She nodded again, the weight of his words settling on her shoulders. It was clear now that there was no turning back. The fight was coming, whether they were ready or not. "I'll be ready," she said, her voice steady. The biker walked over to the door, his hand resting on the handle for a moment before he turned back to look at her. "Stay inside. Don't go outside unless I say so. Trust me, it's for your own good." She watched him leave, his figure disappearing into the street as the door closed softly behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. Her brother stirred on the couch, rubbing his eyes as he looked up at her. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice small and unsure. She forced a smile, sitting beside him. "Nothing we can't handle," she said softly, though her heart was racing. "Just stay close to me, okay?" He nodded, curling up against her. They sat there together, the minutes stretching into hours, each one heavier than the last. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The world outside the door was closing in. She had no idea what the biker was planning, but she knew that whatever happened next, they wouldn't be able to hide anymore. It was time to face the fight head-on. The question now was whether they could win. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the streets, as the girl stood by the window, her gaze fixed on the darkening world outside. The silence in the house was thick, and the tension hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Her brother had fallen. Asleep again, curled up on the couch, but the girl couldn't rest. She kept glancing at the clock, her heart pounding in her chest. It had been hours since the biker left, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. She had thought she was ready, thought she understood the danger they were facing, but as the time passed, the uncertainty crept in once again. What if they weren't ready? What if they couldn't face what was coming? The sound of a motorcycle engine cut through the silence, sharp and powerful. Her heart leaped in her chest, and she rushed to the window, her eyes scanning the street. The familiar rumble of the engine brought a strange sense of relief, but it also made her nervous. He was back. The biker was back. The girl stepped away from the window, her breath shallow, and her mind racing with questions. She knew he had been out there, preparing for what was to come, but she didn't know what kind of battle they would face. She didn't know who was out there, what they wanted, or how far they would go to get it. The door opened slowly, and the biker stepped inside, his face hard and determined. He didn't speak at first, his eyes scanning the room quickly, before landing on the girl. "We need to move," he said, his voice low and urgent. The girl nodded, her heart sinking. "What's happening?" she asked, trying to keep the fear from her voice. The biker paused for a moment before responding. "They know we're here. They found us. It's time to go." The girl's heart dropped. She had been hoping that they were safe here, that the town would provide them with some protection, but now it was clear that wasn't the case. The danger wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "Are we leaving now?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The biker nodded. "Yes. We can't stay here. Not with them this close." She glanced at her brother, who had woken up and was looking at her with wide, fearful eyes. She smiled at him, trying to reassure him, but inside, she was just as scared as he was. "We'll be all right," she whispered to him, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. The biker moved quickly, his hands already gathering supplies, checking his weapons, and making sure everything was ready. He was focused, calm, and steady, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the tightness in his jaw. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about something bigger, something darker. The girl couldn't help but wonder what kind of people they were up against. Who were these enemies, and why had they come after them? What did they want? But now wasn't the time to ask questions. Now was the time to act. "Get your things. We're leaving in 5 minutes," the biker said, his voice sharp and commanding. The girl nodded quickly and turned to her brother. "Come on, let's get ready." They gathered their things in silence, the weight of what was happening pressing down on them. The girl tried to steady her hands as she packed, trying to keep her focus. Her brother was quiet, his small face filled with worry, but he didn't say anything. He was doing his best to be brave, just like she was. The minutes seemed to stretch on endlessly. The girl could feel the urgency in the air, could hear the faint sound of footsteps approaching outside, the unmistakable feeling that they were being hunted. She couldn't shake the sense that they were being watched. Finally, the biker turned to her, his face grim. "It's time," he said simply. She took a deep breath, her heart racing, and grabbed her brother's hand. They followed the biker out of the house, moving quickly, quietly. The town was eerily still, the streets empty, the windows dark. It was like everyone had disappeared. The biker led them down a narrow alleyway, his eyes scanning the surroundings constantly. He moved with purpose, like a man who had been in too many dangerous situations to be caught off guard now. The girl stayed close, her senses alert, every nerve on edge. They reached the end of the alley and stopped. The biker turned to her, his face hard with determination. "Stay close," he said. "No matter what happens, stay close to me." The girl nodded, squeezing her brother's hand tightly. They had come this far. There was no turning back now. As they moved deeper into the shadows, the girl couldn't help but glance back at the house they had just left behind. It seemed so far away now, like a lifetime ago. She had thought it would be their safe haven, but it had only been a temporary refuge. The real fight was just beginning. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, and she stiffened, her heart racing. The biker stopped, his body tense, his eyes narrowing as he listened. "They're close," he muttered. "Get ready." The girl held her breath, her mind racing as she waited for the next move, knowing that whatever happened next would determine their fate. The girl's heart was pounding in her chest as they stood in the alley, the sound of distant footsteps growing louder. The biker's eyes were sharp, scanning the surroundings with a calm intensity, like a predator waiting for its prey. She could feel the tension in the air, thick with the promise of danger, and her grip on her brother's hand tightened. He was beside her, silent and scared, but she could sense the quiet determination in his small body. He was trying to be brave for her, just like she was trying to be strong for him. The biker looked back at them, his face serious. "Stay close," he said in a low voice, barely above a whisper. "No matter what happens, stay with me." She nodded, swallowing hard. She had no idea what was coming, but she knew one thing for sure. They weren't going to let anything happen to her or her brother. The footsteps grew louder. Someone was getting closer, but it wasn't the biker's first time being in a situation like this. He moved with purpose, crouching low, signaling for the girl and her brother to do the same. "Get ready," he murmured, his voice barely audible, but filled with authority. The girl's pulse quickened. She tried to keep her breath steady, but everything inside her was screaming to run. She wasn't sure where to go or what to do, but she trusted the biker. He would lead them through this. Just then, a figure appeared at the end of the alley, emerging from the darkness. The girl's breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped closer, their outline becoming clearer in the dim light. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in dark clothes. He paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the alley, then continued walking toward them. The biker's posture shifted, becoming more rigid, but his face remained calm. "Stay quiet," the biker said. "Wait for my signal." The man's boots clicked against the pavement as he walked closer, unaware of their presence in the shadows. The girl's heart pounded in her chest, every instinct telling her to run, but she stayed frozen, her eyes locked on the biker. He was calculating, waiting for the right moment. The man took a few more steps, and the biker finally moved. He stood up quickly, stepping out from the shadows, his voice cold and firm. "Stop right there." The man froze, his eyes narrowing as he looked up. For a brief moment, everything was still, an electric tension hanging in the air. "Who are you?" the man growled, his voice rough and threatening. The biker didn't flinch. "That's none of your business. But I'm guessing you're here for them," he said, gesturing to the girl and her brother. The man smirked, his expression darkening. "You're not in a position to make demands, friend. Step aside, and nobody gets hurt." The biker stood his ground. "You don't want to do this." The man's smirk faded, replaced by a look of pure menace. "Oh, I do. I really do." In an instant, the man lunged forward, his hand reaching for the gun strapped to his side. But the biker was faster. With a swift movement, he grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it behind his back, forcing him to drop the weapon to the ground. The man grunted in pain, but the biker didn't let go. He shoved him hard against the wall of the alley, his grip tightening. "I said you don't want to do this," the biker repeated, his voice dangerously low. The man struggled for a moment, but the biker's grip was unyielding. He turned to look at the girl and her brother, his eyes still full of calm assurance. "Get inside. Now," he ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. The girl hesitated, but she didn't have to be told twice. She grabbed her brother's hand and pulled him toward the door, her legs moving faster than they ever had before. They weren't safe yet, but they were closer. As they reached the door, she glanced back over her shoulder, watching the biker with a mixture of awe and fear. The sound of the man's struggling grunts faded as they stepped inside, but the girl knew it wasn't over. They had bought some time, but this was just the beginning. The door slammed shut behind them, and the girl leaned against it, trying to catch her breath. Her heart was still racing, but she was alive. They were alive. For now, that was enough. The biker was already at the window, looking out into the street, his body tense with anticipation. "Stay here," he said without turning around. "I need to make sure we're not being followed." She didn't argue. She knew better than to question him now. She and her brother sat down on the couch, the weight of the last few hours pressing down on them. The silence felt different now, filled with uncertainty. The girl couldn't stop thinking about the man in the alley. Who were these people? Why were they after her and her brother? What would happen next? She glanced at her brother, who was sitting quietly beside her, his eyes wide with fear. She wanted to tell him everything was going to be okay, but she wasn't sure if she could keep that promise. For the first time, she wasn't sure if anyone could. The biker returned to the room a few minutes later, his face grim. "They're out there," he said, "and they won't stop until they get what they want." The girl's stomach dropped. This was far from over. The house was still and quiet, the tension thick in the air. The girl sat with her brother, both of them on edge, unsure of what would happen next. The biker had told them to stay put, but her mind was racing. The silence was deafening. She kept glancing at the window, waiting for any sign that the danger had passed, but she knew it hadn't. The sound of footsteps outside seemed to echo louder than before. Her brother, still clutching her hand, was trying his best to stay calm, but she could feel his pulse racing in his tiny fingers. She squeezed his hand reassuringly, but even she wasn't sure how much reassurance she could offer. They weren't safe. Not yet. The biker had gone out to scout, to make sure they weren't being followed, but every minute felt like an eternity. The girl didn't know what she was waiting for, an answer, a signal, anything, but she felt the weight of the moment bearing down on her. She couldn't sit here forever. She had to do something. The girl stood up and walked to the window, peering through the blinds, scanning the street. It looked quiet, but something about the calmness unsettled her. It was too quiet. She knew something was coming. Then, the sound of a car engine broke the silence. It was faint at first, but it grew louder as it neared. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned away from the window quickly and looked at her brother. He was watching her, his eyes wide with fear. She smiled at him, though it didn't reach her eyes. "It's going to be okay," she whispered, though she wasn't sure she believed it. The girl moved to the door and pressed her ear against it, listening carefully. The sound of the engine was close now. Too close. The biker had said they weren't being followed, but this felt like more than just coincidence. She glanced back at her brother, who was still sitting on the couch, clutching his knees to his chest. The girl stepped away from the door and grabbed her brother's hand again. "We need to get ready," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. He nodded, his eyes still filled with worry, but there was a flicker of trust in them. He was scared, but he was following her lead. She had to stay strong for him. They couldn't let the fear take over. The girl moved quickly through the house, gathering whatever supplies they could, food, water, anything that might be useful in case they needed to leave in a hurry. The tension was suffocating, but she couldn't afford to freeze up. Not now. As she worked, she could hear the car getting closer. The sound of the engine seemed to be right outside the door now. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't stop. She kept moving, her eyes flicking between the door and her brother. She didn't want him to see how scared she was. She didn't want to give in to the panic that was rising inside her. The car engine cut off abruptly. A knock sounded on the door, sharp and deliberate. Her breath caught in her throat. "Don't open it," she whispered to her brother, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to stay calm. She turned to look at the door, then back to her brother. She could see the fear in his eyes, but she could also see something else, a quiet trust in her. "Stay behind me," she said, trying to sound as confident as possible. "We'll be okay." Another knock came, louder this time. Whoever was on the other side wasn't going to go away easily. She turned to the window again, her heart in her throat. The street was still empty, but the sound of footsteps on the porch told her everything she needed to know. They were here for them. She didn't know if it was the people after her, but she wasn't going to take any chances. The girl grabbed her brother's hand and motioned for him to follow her quietly as she moved to the back door. She had no idea who was out there, but the biker had warned her that they would stop at nothing to find them. She wasn't about to let them succeed. They weren't going to catch them. Not yet. She crept toward the back door, her breath shallow, trying to remain as silent as possible. The sound of the knock came again, louder this time. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of the door handle turning. She froze, her body tense. Whoever was on the other side was trying to get in. The girl's mind raced, but she didn't hesitate. She reached for the door handle, ready to act. She had to protect her brother. She had to protect them both. The door opened just slightly, and she could see the faint outline of someone outside. "What do you want?" she called out, her voice steady even though her heart was pounding. There was no answer, only the sound of a low, gravelly voice. "We're looking for someone. You seen anyone new around here?" The girl didn't respond, her fingers tightening around her brother's hand. She knew she couldn't trust them. "No," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You need to leave." She could hear the man outside muttering, but the door didn't budge. She waited, every second feeling like an eternity, but nothing happened. Finally, the man's voice faded, and she heard footsteps retreating. The girl let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. They were safe for now, but the fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She closed the door quietly and turned to her brother. "We need to go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're not safe here anymore." The girl stood in the middle of the room, her mind racing. The knock on the door had shaken her, but it was the sound of footsteps retreating that left her breathless. Whoever had been outside wasn't here anymore, but she couldn't let her guard down. She looked at her brother, still holding tightly onto her hand, his face pale with fear. He had stayed silent through all of it, but she could see the fear in his eyes. He had always trusted her, but now, with everything happening around them, he was starting to look to her more than ever for reassurance. And she was doing her best to give it, though inside, she was just as scared. She glanced back toward the door. The man had come and gone, but what if there were more of them? What if they weren't the only ones looking for them? The biker had warned her that the danger wasn't over. She didn't know who they were up against, or what they wanted, But she knew it wasn't just about her and her brother anymore. There was something much bigger at play here. The biker had left again to check the streets, but she couldn't sit still. She had to act. She couldn't just wait for things to happen. She had to take control. Slowly, she walked over to the window, peering through the blinds to get a better view of the street. It was still quiet, but she could see the faint outlines of vehicles parked in the distance. It was impossible to tell if they were just random cars or if they had been there for a reason. The uncertainty gnawed at her. She couldn't risk being caught off guard again. She turned to her brother, who was still huddled in the corner, clutching a worn-out toy in his hands. "We need to go," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "We can't stay here." Her brother looked up at her, his eyes wide, not fully understanding the weight of her words. But he could tell from her expression that something was wrong. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice trembling. She hesitated for a moment. She didn't have a solid plan. She didn't know where they would go next. But they had to leave. Staying here meant staying in danger. "We'll figure it out," she said, forcing a smile. "Just stay close to me." The girl moved to the door and opened it slowly, peeking outside to make sure the coast was clear. The street was still empty, and the air was thick with tension. She stepped outside, glancing around quickly. The biker was nowhere to be seen, and the street was eerily quiet. But she knew they couldn't afford to wait. She motioned for her brother to follow, her voice barely above a whisper. "Come on." They moved quickly but quietly down the alley, the only sound the soft crunch of gravel under their feet. The girl's mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything, but the only thing that mattered now was getting out of sight. The alley twisted and turned, and she kept glancing over her shoulder, making sure no one was following. Her heart was pounding, her thoughts scattered, but she kept moving, trusting her instincts. They reached the end of the alley, and the girl stopped, her eyes scanning the street in front of them. It was still quiet, too quiet, but she couldn't afford to second-guess herself now. She could feel the weight of her brother's hand in hers, his fingers tightly gripping her own. "We're almost there," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Just stay close." They crossed the street and ducked into another alley, hoping to blend in with the shadows. The girl's mind kept racing, thinking of every possible scenario. What if they ran into the people who were after them? What if they couldn't outrun them? What if they were trapped again? She shook her head, pushing those thoughts away. They couldn't afford to think like that. They had to keep moving, stay one step ahead. As they moved further down the alley, the girl's eyes caught something up ahead, a figure in the distance, moving quickly through the shadows. It was hard to make out who it was, but something about their posture made her freeze. The figure was moving with purpose, just like the biker. But there was something different about the way they carried themselves. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. They weren't alone. She squeezed her brother's hand, pulling him closer. "Stay behind me," she whispered. The figure was getting closer, and her heart was racing. She didn't know what to do. Her first instinct was to run, but the alley was too narrow. The figure was too close. Her mind raced through every possible way to escape, but her thoughts were interrupted as the figure stepped into the light. The girl's breath caught in her throat. It was the biker. He was back, but his face was tense, his eyes scanning the alley like a man who had just walked straight into danger. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice a mixture of relief and confusion. The biker didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked past her, his eyes darting down the alley. "We've got company," he said quietly. "Move. Now." The biker's voice was steady, but the urgency in his tone made the girl's heart race. "Move, now," he repeated, his eyes scanning the alley for any sign of danger. The girl grabbed her brother's hand and pulled him close. Her mind was spinning, the adrenaline kicking in, but she knew they didn't have time to hesitate. They had to go. She looked up at the biker, trying to get a read on his expression, but his face was unreadable, a mask of focus. He had told her there was company, and from the way he moved, it wasn't just any kind of company. She could feel the weight of his words. The stakes were high. They couldn't afford to be caught. The alley they had been moving through was narrow, the walls closing in as they picked up their pace. Every step felt louder than the last, the echoes of their footsteps almost deafening in the quiet of the night. The girl glanced behind them, her eyes scanning the darkness. There was no sign of anyone, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, like they were surrounded, hunted. The biker led them swiftly, his body poised and alert. His movements were precise, calculated, like he was always one step ahead. She could feel the tension in his every stride. He was keeping them safe, but she could see the worry in his eyes. He knew something they didn't. Something was coming. As they reached the end of the alley, the girl felt a surge of fear. They were close to the street, but she knew that crossing it would put them in plain sight. The biker stopped, motioning for them to stay behind him. He stood still for a moment, listening, his eyes darting from left to right. Then he turned to face the girl. "Stay low," he instructed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't make a sound." The girl nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. They had no choice now. They had to move. The biker led them out of the alley and into the shadow of a nearby building. She could feel the cold against her skin, the dampness of the night air creeping through her clothes. The street in front of them was deserted, the headlights from distant cars illuminating the empty road. She looked to her brother, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. She squeezed his hand, offering what little comfort she could. They couldn't stop now. They had to keep going. They were so close. But as they started to cross the street, a sound stopped them dead in their tracks. The girl froze, her body tensing, her pulse racing. Footsteps. Heavy footsteps. Someone was coming. She turned her head, her eyes scanning the shadows, searching for any sign of movement. And then she saw them. Figures. Dark, looming shapes moving toward them from the far end of the street. The biker tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon at his side. The girl's breath caught in her throat. She could see the figures more clearly now. There were 3 of them, all tall, their silhouettes unmistakable in the dim light. They were coming straight for them, moving quickly, their footsteps steady and unrelenting. The biker stepped in front of her and her brother, his body positioned protectively. He didn't hesitate. He was ready. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice calm, but with a cold edge of authority. "Don't make a sound." The girl nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt the weight of the moment, the danger that was closing in on them. She could feel the air shift, the sense of inevitability sinking into her bones. The figures were getting closer, their footsteps echoing like a drumbeat in the night. The biker stood his ground, his hand resting on his weapon. He was ready for whatever came next, but she wasn't sure she was. "Who are you?" the biker called out, his voice steady, but his eyes were cold, alert. The figures didn't stop. They kept walking toward them, their faces hidden in the shadows. The girl could feel her breath catch in her throat. This was it. They had nowhere to run. They were surrounded. The figures reached the edge of the street, and the girl saw their faces for the first time. They were men, rough-looking, their eyes cold and unforgiving. One of them stepped forward, his gaze locking with the bikers. "We're looking for something," the man said, his voice low and dangerous. "And we're not leaving without it." The biker didn't flinch. "You'll have to go through me first," he replied, his voice calm, but every word held the weight of a threat. The man smirked, his hand resting on a weapon at his side. "If that's the way it's gonna be." The girl held her breath, her heart pounding. She was frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. All she could do was watch as the tension between the 2 men escalated. This was no longer just about her or her brother. This was about survival. The biker stepped forward, his body tense, his eyes focused on the men. The moment was approaching, the moment when everything would change. And she had no idea what would happen next.